Well, welcome to our video history. Our interviewee this afternoon is Dr. David Grimes, and I want to start really at the beginning for David. So, David, where were you born?
I was born in Waterbury, Connecticut.
Or when did you decide that you wanted to become a physician?
Early on. You know, we doctors tend to be bimodal when we decide, either very early or very late. And I was in the former camp. I grew up quite young. By the time I was in first grade, I recognized that the world is not just a place of Santa Claus and Easter bunnies and trick-or-treating, but it was a dangerous place where good people got sick and died for no reason. The polio epidemic was sweeping through the South when I was a small child in Atlanta. Indeed, classmates of mine were winding up in iron lungs. That was a frightening time. The pools were closed, theaters were closed. I recognized at that time the only way I was going to be able to make it through the decades ahead was to be able to fight back in some constructive ways. And as a 7-year-old, I decided that had to be medicine.
So it was really the illnesses that you saw around you. It wasn't so much a mentor or a family figure that put you in the path of becoming a physician.
No, I think, if anything, the polio epidemic. I was actually a participant in the Salk vaccine trials as a first grader when Jonas Salk came down from Michigan. I later had a role model in my family physician, but I decided by the time I was in first or second grade that was the life path for me.
Well, you know, having had a mother who had polio back in the early 50s, I can certainly appreciate the concern and how horrible that disease was.
Well, indeed, 2 of my med school classmates to this day wear leg braces from their bouts with polio.
Well, where did you end up going to medical school?
At Chapel Hill. I was a North Carolinian and was happy to get back to the South to go to med school at Chapel Hill.
Didn't you go up the East? You went to Harvard undergrad,
I did.
If I recall correctly.
I had my undergraduate work at Harvard, and I was happy to get back in the South. I loved Cambridge and the Harvard environment, but the weather didn't suit me at all.
Well, I can understand that.
I lost my car in a blizzard there in February of '69. I said, that's enough of the cold weather.
Oh, my goodness. So, what part of your medical school training got you motivated to become an obstetrician gynecologist?
I got interested in population biology as an undergraduate. And then I think the next thing that was strongly influential was just pure hedonism. I had such a blast as a third-year student on OBGYN. I thought, gosh, this would be a fun way to spend the next few decades, and it turned out I was right.
Any particular individuals there at Chapel Hill that sort of turned you on becoming an obstetrician gynecologist?
Well, as you well know, having trained there with me, we were extremely fortunate to be in a unique place. Our chairman, Chuck Hendricks, was a great humanitarian and a wonderful teacher. And among the residents ahead of me who were role models for me as a medical student, I still think of Charles Welander. When Charles arrived at Chapel Hill, everyone wanted to know who's the new attending. He was a first-year resident, and I said, wow, if that's what an OBGYN is like, I want to be like that when I grow up.
You know, I took Charlie's locker when he left. So
no, I didn't know that, but he cast a long shadow on both our lives, it sounds like.
He really did. But you had a unique residency.
I did, as you know.
You know, tell us about how your residency was tailored for you.
Well, we were products of our time, and Vietnam was still an issue. They were drafting 95% of us male physicians when we got out, so it wasn't a matter of if you went, but when you went to the service. I had strong political opposition to the Vietnam War. I knew we were being lied to, and we were right. So I was happy to serve my country. I'm not a pacifist by any means, but I wasn't going to take part in Vietnam. So I had 2 choices. I could either emigrate to Canada, and as you know, I don't like cold weather, or else I could join the public health service. I really worked hard to get my foot in the door at the CDC, and subsequently got a commission there. So I did 2 years of residency, dropped out for 2 years to meet my military requirement, then came back and finished up. By the way, that's the only way to do a residency, is take a sabbatical in the middle.
Maybe we need to talk to the Residency Review Committee for that. Because it's interesting, when you left, and I sort of moved up a year, and we worked together when you came back. So I got to fill your slots while you were down in Atlanta.
And you were very kind to me upon my return. I still remember you walked me through my first hysterectomy.
Oh, my goodness. Well, when you finished, what was your first job after training there in Chapel Hill?
I'd had such a blast at the CDC that I went back with a joint appointment at the CDC on the career staff there, and also as an assistant professor at Emory. And I spent a number of years happily in Atlanta doing both public health and also clinical OBGYN. It was a great job.
So were you and Bert Peterson both doing that at around the same time?
I confess to having recruited Bert to the CDC, and when he was down there, we made some forays to Bangladesh together.
Well, when your time in Atlanta changed, tell me how your career has evolved over the I guess about 30 years or so now.
Yeah, actually 40.
Yeah.
I had planned to spend 20 years at the CDC. I was very, very happy there until my writings were censored by the Reagan administration in 1985. I wasn't going to have any part of censorship, so I resigned my commission and moved to Los Angeles, where I joined the department at the University of Southern California with Dan Michel. Worked there for 6.5 years and moved up to San Francisco, where I was chief at San Francisco General, and then in 1997 moved back to Chapel Hill, where I had a joint appointment with both FHI, Family Health International, and UNC, our alma mater.
Well, looking back, you've had a very interesting career, and we'll get to more of that. But which physician was your favorite?
Hal, in all honesty, I liked every one of them. I enjoyed every place I was and enjoyed every job I had. They all were fun. They all were fun. And that's always been one of my guidelines. I thought that it got to be the point where I didn't look forward to getting out of bed in the morning and going to work. I'd do something different.
Well, tell me about your involvement with ACOG.
I got involved early on. As a matter of fact, during my time at the CDC in the mid-1970s, started serving on commissions and committees and task forces, and it was one of the highlights of my academic career, having worked in many different volunteer capacities with the college. Great fun, important work, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And I know you have helped us immensely on many, many different documents, and your research on reproductive health care has been just crucial. Now that you're retired, I think that's
ostensibly.
Yeah. Sounds like you're working.
I'm currently
just as hard.
unsalaried, but busy, yes.
Yeah. How do you see yourself still contributing to our literature?
I'm still writing now, mainly in social media, though. Just had an op-ed piece published 2 days ago concerning the Republican assault on the reproductive rights of women. I'm still teaching on the road several times a year. My colleague Ken Schultz and I have been teaching a research methods course now since 1987. We've had more than 2,000 OBGYNs through that course, and we plan on continuing that in the years ahead. Still do some consulting and some lecturing, resident research days, so I'm still professionally active, but no longer seeing patients.
Do you miss it?
No, I thought it was time to retire. I wanted to retire young enough to tackle my bucket list, and I think one of the most important responsibilities of physicians my age is to get out of the way and let younger people take over.
Well, that's a great way to look at it, because I know through your career and all of our careers, as we get into this age group, we have the opportunity to open doors for other people and facilitate their advancement.
I think you're right. It's important we not overstay our welcome. Many physicians, I think, have a hard time retiring. I always suggested to the third-year students that you should make a conscious decision, preferably during med school, whether you want medicine to be your life or your life's work. And there's a big difference, and many physicians don't make that decision.
Yeah.
And many physicians really have no life outside of medicine, and they can't retire happily. I've been fortunate throughout to have a happy life outside of medicine. So.
Well, I know you like to be on the water.
I do.
And I know now you're able to do that a whole lot more than you used to be able to.
I live on the water now. It's great.
That's good. Of your activities at ACOG, were there any particular ones that you thought had a dramatic impact, or a more dramatic impact than others? Was there one thing you were really immensely proud of?
The Healthcare Commission was enormous fun. The GYN Practice Committee I enjoyed greatly. I was on the Patient Education Committee for a while as well, and the impact of that with the millions and millions of those documents that we produced was probably immeasurable. ACOG activities were, for me, fun, the networking was great, and the impact was enormous. Like that E.F. Hutton ad, when he speaks, everyone listens. When the college speaks, people listen.
In my position now, I interview lots of people for different positions and things. And one of the questions that I use that I want to ask of you is I want to know what you are most proud of looking back on your career. What would be the thing that you thought was the greatest accomplishment that you had?
I think, if anything, it would be my serving as a midwife to help introduce evidence-based medicine into our field. I became a fan of that early on and tried to set the department at San Francisco General Hospital on that paradigm, and I think it's been successful. So I've also helped nudge the college along that way, and it's been fun to see that evolve into an evidence-based. For example, the practice bulletins now, which are thoroughly researched, and they actually grade the level of evidence supporting these recommendations. That's a huge step forward for our profession.
And I think a very important one.
I do as well.
Well, when we have high points sadly, we also have low points. What would be your most disappointing professional endeavor that you could recall?
Well, we're living through it right now, Hal. That's the saddest thing. We had Roe v. Wade come down my senior year of medical school in January of 1973, and since then we've had 4 decades of extraordinary public health success with safe legal abortion. Yet now we're seeing this assault, this absolute epidemic of anti-abortion legislation that's trying to send women into the back alley once again. And that indeed was the motivation for my first big project in retirement, and that was my book, Every Third Woman in America, How Legal Abortion Transformed Our Nation. Because physicians younger than us don't know what those days were like. I was born in 1947, and in that year, more than 700 American women died of unsafe abortion. And the Republican Party wants to return to those days. I think women deserve better.
I agree with you. I really hope that we could get women to understand how important it is for them to stand up for their rights too.
I agree. And the Republican Party has had as a plank in its platform since the 1980s the total abolition of abortion. I just recently reviewed their party platform approved in Tampa at the 2012 convention, and it calls for a constitutional amendment to overturn Roe v. Wade. And there was no mention in the document of 60 pages of any exception for rape, incest, or life endangerment. Right. That's just cruel beyond words.
Well, you're probably one of the most eloquent and well-studied person on reproductive care. But we have both lived through an amazing time in the profession of obstetrics and gynecology, amazing changes. How do you see our profession, our specialty, evolving?
It's been an exciting transition, as you suggest. At the time you and I were training, OBGYN was sort of in the backwaters of academia, and the brightest students were discouraged from going into OBGYN. They should go to internal medicine or something more scholarly. That's been completely turned around. Now some of the finest science and some of the most important breakthroughs occurring in our field of reproductive medicine. Just look at any of the major medical journals. Every week there's something of relevance to women's health. So it's been an exciting transition. I think the vistas are absolutely wide open in the years ahead.
How do you see the changes in practice? I mean, I know you've pretty much been in academia the whole time, but the people we have trained and have gone out, how do you see their practices compared to those we had in the 80s and 90s?
Again, I'm too parochial, having been in the rarefied atmosphere of academia all this time, especially big county hospitals, to comment. But I think things are getting more and more difficult for our colleagues, and some of the joy of medicine may have disappeared.
Well, I'm going to go to another interesting area. I mean, in our careers, we have seen the real birth of subspecialization. And we can all remember we had faculty who would say that their job was to train us well enough to put themselves out of business. Those days are gone.
Right.
How do you see the benefit or the problem with the way subspecialization has developed and expanded in OBGYN?
I think it's a problem in that one of the criticisms of subspecialization is that one's focus can become so microscopic that it fails to be binocular. In contrast, I think generals have a broader view of what women's health is all about. And there's certainly a certain element of elitism in leadership within academic medicine today. There are very few chairs in this country who are generalists. That's why I'm pleased to be helping FACOG, the new Generalist Society, get off the ground, because I think it will help to give it legitimacy and stature in academia, which it clearly deserves.
Yeah, and FACOG is a great entity, and I agree with you. It needs to get its feet squarely on the ground. How do you think we can help it? What suggestions would you have?
Well, I've been donating my time. I spoke to the group last year, and I'm giving a keynote address tomorrow morning at the meeting. So I'm trying to work behind the scenes to encourage this. It's a long overdue. Generalists should not be second-class citizens in an academic department.
If you were talking to a group of medical students, third-year medical students, why would you tell them they should become an obstetrician gynecologist?
As you know, I got interested in preventive medicine during medical school, and I was sort of schizoid. I'd never forget what I was going to do. So after I got trained and boarded in OBGYN, I got further training and got boarded in preventive medicine. And most of what we do in OBGYN today is prevention. It was we and not the internists or the family doctors who brought prevention to America. Most of what we do, from contraception to prenatal care, is preventive medicine. It has huge impact, huge impact. And having had a dual career for 4 decades now doing both, the compare and contrast has been interesting. In clinical medicine, we have the immediate gratification of an appreciative patient and her family. I always enjoyed going out talking to the family after the OR was done. But in public health, it's very different. We never know the name or the face of the person whose disease we avoided or whose life we saved. But as Bill Foege, my former boss at the CDC, used to comment, this may be the most noble medicine of all, the anonymous gift of health. What we do in OBGYN is that.
I think that's very well stated. You know, I think our specialty demographics have changed too. And you know, when we were there, it was mostly all men, and today it's about 83% female. How do you think that's going to continue that way? Do you think we'll see a swing back with more gender diversity again?
I don't see it in the near future. Again, I remember the days when we had to reverse the polarity on the call rooms and the locker rooms. We have to look long and hard to find a male candidate for the residency these days. But I hope that we'll also bring in more flexibility into OBGYN residency training, as women have many more responsibilities than we men do, specifically child care. So I think that working part-time jobs or splitting residencies is going to bring more enlightenment to our field. It won't be a lockstep approach like it used to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know that the RRC has had people come to them and talk about should there be ways to take time off in residency and come back. And
I have strong feelings having taken a sabbatical in the middle of mine, as you know.
I know. You know, there are a lot of changes going on in healthcare delivery right now, not just OBGYN, with the Affordable Care Act, now that the SGR reform has been repealed, and we're looking at a value-based payment system. You've worked a lot with ACOG. What suggestions would you have for ACOG as to how we could be helping our members and the women of this country? Is there something that we should be looking at doing that we're not doing?
Nothing that I can think of, Hal. I've been extraordinarily proud of what the college has done for the fellowship, fighting the good fights, both in terms of reimbursement and also in terms of women's reproductive rights, the amicus briefs and so forth. I'm particularly proud of what we had accomplished during the Obama administration with the Affordable Care Act. The Washington Post a couple weeks ago did fact-checking on the government's claim that ACA has helped to save about 50,000 American lives, and they confirmed it. That's an extraordinary accomplishment. That's almost the same number of lives that were lost during the Vietnam War. It was fully predictable. Estimates were that from 18,000 to 45,000 lives are lost every year in this country, just for lack of access to health care. So providing decent health care for every American is a very important step forward. And I don't understand the opposition to it. I simply don't.
Yeah, I agree. But we also have an issue of maldistribution of OBGYNs. You know, we train people and they tend to stay in the urban areas. How can we get OBGYN care out to more people? How can we improve that access issue so that we can help make people healthier like you?
I think it's going to have to do with incentives and disincentives. And right now there are lots of disincentives and not many incentives for an OBGYN after expensive training, and perhaps with educational loans still to pay off to go into a small town. I think if that were incentivized through the government with salary subsidies, we might see more centrifugal spread.
Well, you know, there's more and more discussion about telemedicine. And I know you've been involved with a lot of IT and issues. Where do you see that moving?
I think it's an exciting movement. For example, Dan Grossman, one of my former colleagues at San Francisco, has done some very pioneering work with telemedicine for medication abortion in Iowa. Yet we see in state after state these legislative proposals by the Republicans to shut that down. It makes eminently good sense.
Well, it seems like it would be a way to be able to provide care with the appropriate setup, without having to have physicians every place that they have to be.
In the era of Citrix and Skype, I think we're seeing a lot less travel now and a lot more meetings on the line.
You know, as our healthcare system changes, what do you see, or do you see potential threats on the horizon for outside of reproductive health care? for OBGYN? Do you see that this system, as it's evolving, will be a benefit to us or maybe a threat to us?
A couple of threats I think are imminent to all Americans, and one is the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court, which has allowed billionaires to hijack the government. Now the thought is that Republican candidates, for example, won't be vetted in state elections, but rather will be vetted by a couple of billionaires in the middle part of the country. That is really obscene. That is not democracy. That's plutocracy. That has me greatly concerned. The Hobby Lobby decision is also gravely concerning to me. The notion that an employer could have say-so as to what contraception a woman uses, it's none of their business. It's none of their business. So I think we've had some extremely dangerous Supreme Court precedents. It's a very unusual court now, very unusual court. For the first time in our history, we don't have a single Protestant on the Supreme Court. There are 6 Catholics. 24% of Americans are Catholics, 67% of the Supreme Court is Catholic. That kind of disparity is unlikely to occur by chance alone.
Interesting, interesting. You know, ACOG moved to Washington in 1981. We went there so that we could become better advocates. And we really try to aspire to do that. Do you see the advocacy that ACOG is doing in the right direction, or do you think there are other things we could improve on?
Oh, I'm sure there's always room for improvement, but ACOG is doing a marvelous job, and I'm intensely proud of what ACOG's done not only before but after the move to Washington, D.C. You're right where you need to be, close to the center of power. And all these other organizations that are kindred spirits. We've got a difficult battle ahead.
Well, you know, being in my position now, and having 59,000 total members and about 41 or 2,000 fellows and junior fellows, we're not all of the same mind on some of these issues, and that can be problematic. Obviously, your positions are very clear and well defined. But any thoughts or suggestions as to how to deal with folks who may be diametrically opposed to your position on reproductive health?
I understand and respect their positions, but mine is not only personally felt, but evidence-based. If, for example, you look at contraception or sterilization or abortion, the evidence is clear and incontrovertible. The ethical or moral debates will continue. The public health debates were settled 4 decades ago. Indeed, in 1975, just 2 years after Roe v. Wade, the Institute of Medicine published its report showing that by that time, within 2 years, it was clearly established that legal abortion was good for the nation's health. It's good for women, it's good for their families, it's good for society. It's a win-win-win. So that argument was settled, and we as a professional society need to say, we will do what's best for our patients. We understand some may disagree, don't take part.
Well, you know, as our practices have changed, and you chose this path to really be an epidemiologist.
I've had a schizoid career, guilty as charged.
Well, a little schizophrenia can be just fine. Why did you, I know you did not do a true fellowship. Did you debate about doing fellowship?
Well, Hal, I was saved there by being so old there were no such things when I came through initially. Again, there were no fellowships, so as residents we got to do it all, did radical vulvas and radical hysterectomies. But the CDC sort of sufficed that filled that niche for me, and I got extra training there and went back and took some MPH courses at Emory, which enabled me to sit for my preventive medicine boards in the mid-1980s. So that was my pseudo-fellowship.
Well, technology continues to push us in many different directions. And I'm not going to talk about morcellation or mesh. we've had those.
You've been there and done that, right?
We've been there and done that. We got those T-shirts. But when we look at cancer screening, I mean, the evolution of HPV screening and HPV vaccination is incredible. How do you see this evolving further in the practice of obstetrics and gynecology?
Well, the pace is so brisk now, it's just hard to keep up. I'm sure you had the same difficulty I do with all these new screening approaches. But we made huge inroads with cervical cancer during our professional lifetimes. Right. And the thought to have a vaccine against cancer, I never thought I'd see that during my professional lifetime. It's extraordinarily exciting. Talk about prevention. There's a prototype for you. Immunization against cancer. It's marvelous. We need better uptake. But look at the opposition we're seeing to traditional things like measles, mumps, and rubella.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
The anti-vaxxers are also the anti-abortion people. They don't believe in science.
It's very difficult. As our fellows continue to work and redefine their practices, what advice would you give them about how to maintain the cutting edge knowledge? What should they be looking at out there in the world literature? I mean, there's ACOG things, there's other things, but you have kept right on the cusp throughout your practice, throughout your career. How would you advise others to do that?
Well, I was lucky. As we discussed before, I was sort of parachuted into the CDC in the middle of my training and was surrounded by some world-class scholars and began to learn a bit about science, which is not part of the usual agenda of a residency program. So I was blessed in that regard to have a little leg up on my colleagues. But as you suggest, it's key to learn how to read. There's a paradox. Our residency graduates are turned out full of the products of science, like an overstuffed sofa. Yet we're oftentimes not very scientific in how we think about patients and their problems. David Sackett did some interesting studies in Canada, and he showed that if you learn evidence-based medicine during your training, you can rust-proof your practice for at least 15 years. Otherwise, we get on this slippery downhill slope and we get rustier and rustier. So learning evidence-based medicine during med school and residency is the best thing I know to stay abreast, so you don't get stale.
Well, it brings up a great issue, I think. Because I think, all residents don't come out with the same level of evidence-based understanding. That's getting better, but how would you see teaching that in the postgraduate environment, like at the annual meeting or at district meetings? Any ideas as to how we could make our members better readers and better epidemiologists of understanding the literature?
Well, there have been a number of ACOG postgraduate courses on this. I've taken part in some with people like George Sawai from UCSF, who's one of my favorite gurus and a marvelous, marvelous teacher. The college could play a bigger role, but the fact that it's now using evidence-based principles in developing its own bulletins and publications is a marvelous step forward. We moved away, and I think in the 80s, from the old Bogside approach. Do you know that acronym?
I don't.
Bunch of old guys or gals sitting around a table.
I should know it. I qualify.
So do I. I spent many a weekend in the womb room on the 6th floor as we ponder what we should say. But now it's much more evidence-based. So we should look through the evidence, figure out what it says, then make a decision based on consensus. That's the model for the next century.
I think you're right. I think making those epidemiological evidence-based courses attractive to get people to participate.
The way to do it is to have clinicians teach it.
Yeah.
That's what made it come alive for me as a medical student at Chapel Hill. A few of my internal medicine faculty had been to the CDC as epidemic intelligence service officers and came back and made that stuff come alive at the bedside. I said, this is neat stuff. This might help me be a better doctor.
Well, there's another thing I think has happened in our practice lifetime. I think it's all physicians, but especially OBGYNs have fallen in love with technology. And just because it's new and it's sexy, we should do it. How do we guard against that?
As you know, I have strong feelings about this.
That's why I'm asking.
I was a second-year resident when the first electronic fetal monitor was wheeled into labor and delivery. And the question in all our minds on that fateful morning was, how do we hook this thing up? The question we should have had was, should we hook this thing up? To whom, and what's the evidence that's going to help anybody? But we didn't. We could have and should have predicted 40 years ago it would have no impact because it's a screening test. And when you do a screening test for a very rare disease, such as cerebral palsy or fetal death during labor, the screening test has no predictive value positive. So that was a huge disaster that my generation foisted on America. We've had some successes, though. We held the line with home uterine activity monitoring. That was shown to be worthless. That was already $250 million. My current windmill that I'm tilting at is the robot. I gave a speech at the Society for Gynecologic Surgeons meeting last month.
I was there. It was an excellent talk.
Thanks. When you have a $2 million hammer, the entire world looks like a nail. But there's no evidence this is established for anything in gynecology.
But industry has sort of gotten ahead of the game here. And how do we pull it back and get people to study this before we adopt it?
Couldn't agree more. We have to be spiritual Missourians. In 1899, Willard D. Vandiver was the governor of Missouri, and he gave a speech in Philadelphia in which he said, well, I'm from Missouri, and you've got to show me. And in that sentence, he crystallized the essence of scientific skepticism, and also gave the state its nickname, which is still on their license plates. So no matter where our fellows practice, I hope you will be a spiritual Missourian and say, well, that's very interesting. Show me the data that that's better than what I'm now doing. And as the college rightfully said a few years ago, vaginal hysterectomy remains the best hysterectomy.
You know, you just said something that I think 20 years from now, when somebody looks back about David Grimes, they're going to say, show me the data.
I can't claim it. It was Willard D. Vandiver.
I understand, but I think
I'm happy to
your legacy is so much understand the data, understand the evidence, and that's something you've got to be really proud of.
I am, but don't be as gullible as I was as a young doctor. I made lots of mistakes. And one of my, well, sure, but one of my reasons for being such a keen advocate of evidence-based medicine is shame. I'm ashamed of some of the stupid and harmful things I did to my patients years ago because I wasn't critical enough in my thinking.
Well, David, this has been a wonderful time to chat with you, and you have certainly been a leader and a guiding light, I think, in our profession.
Thanks, Hal.
And it was a privilege to have this opportunity to chat with you today, and thank you very much for all you've done and all you've done to help the women of this country as well as the practicing OBGYNs.
Thanks, my pleasure, Hal.